well. We're kind of doing a little adapt and overcome with our normal clicker for the projector here wasn't working, so we had to download an app. And therefore, utilizing my phone, not texting while reading the presentation screen. Thank you, CJ, for the warm welcome and introduction, and thank you guys. It's been a pleasure serving the WPA Spokane chapter for the last year and a half, and look forward to doing more with the local chapter and the state board at the same time. So, again, I appreciate it. I know CJ was talking about me being young and accomplishing various things. None of that has been without due to various instructors and previous generations paving the way for me in the aviation realm. So I look at these opportunities as just a way that I can get back to the industry for both generations have come and those that already have. So again, I appreciate it. Tonight's discussion, as you probably have already heard or seen, is going to be on cross-country planning, but specifically as it relates to effective aeronautical decision-making. So the reason why I picked that subject and why we're looking at it from kind of a different perspective is because cross-country planning can take multiple different viewpoints, depending on what aircraft you're flying or what mission you're specifically doing. Cross-country planning can look very different, but the one thing that doesn't look different, that doesn't change, is the mindset that we can take, the mindset that we can approach when it comes to flying and cross-country planning. So that's kind of what we're going to take a look at today as we go through this presentation. So first slide here is really defining what is aeronautical decision making, and everyone can kind of have more of a personal definition when it comes to that. But the FAA, specifically on the pilot handbook of knowledge here, defines this ADM as a systematic approach to risk assessment and stress management. So again, ADM stands for aeronautical decision making. So it's a systematic approach to risk assessment and stress management. So to understand ADM is to also understand how personal attitudes can influence decision making and how those attitudes can be modified to enhance safety in the flight deck. So why does this matter and how does this relate to cross-country flying? You might ask. Who cares what kind of attitude I have or why analyzing risks or any of that matters, risk assessment, stress management? Well, it matters because the decisions we make matter. So despite all the changes in technology to improve flight safety, one factor remains the same, and that is the human factor, which leads to curves. It is estimated that approximately 80% of all aviation accidents are related to human factors, and the vast majority of these accidents occur during landing and takeoff. And if you were present during the presentation that I gave about 1.5 years ago, that's what my presentation was actually on. It was on avoiding in-air accidents, collisions, whether it be with terrain or other aircraft. But we find out that the leading cause in most of those accidents, again, are human error, pilot error. They're related to us making poor decisions or a decision that wasn't calculated based on the inherent risk in the matter. So the reason why we talk about that as it relates to cross-country planning is because it plays, our human factor plays a major aspect in the success of our flight, especially in the realms of safety. So should have a nice graph popping up here in a second. I know it might be hard for some of you guys to see here, but basically it's just highlighting the paragraph that we just talked about there. So those the two tallest columns that you see there is a percentage of general aviation accidents as it relates to various phases in flight. So those two tallest ones there are landing and takeoff, the 23 and 24%. So you can see that's where most of our accidents occur in flight. So therefore, we could also logically link that's where most of the risk is involved with flying during the takeoff and landing portion. However, not to be ignored by some of the the third and fourth highest columns in there would be cruise and maneuvering. So this is kind of where we're going to be linking that into our cross-country planning, where we talk about the various phases that are going to affect our flights. So how do we mitigate risk, right? That's kind of the million-dollar question. When we're planning a cross-country and we're getting ready to go fly, the first thing that we need to be discussing and thinking about is risk. Because everything that we do in life is risk management, whether we're driving down I-90 or you're hopping in your tail dragger and you're going to go fly down to Pullman for the weekend. So all of that involves various risk and risk factors. So we start by identifying the threats. That's the first step when it comes to risk management, is identifying what are the threats that are going to impact my flight today? And there could be multiple different threats depending on where we're flying and where we're going, right? Weather is a huge one. That one is going to be a factor regardless of what season or month of the year that we're flying in. And we know that the months that we're approaching now, as we've seen this morning with frost and some of the snow that's been passing through the area, presents us with a new threat, especially in general aviation, because most of our general aviation aircraft are not equipped with anti-ice or de-icing aircraft or equipment. Right? So this plays a huge threat as far as where we're going to go, what time we're going to leave, etc. All these things pop in. Terrain, that's another big one in our area, right? Terrain can pose major risk and a major threat to where we're flying. We talk about mountain ranges, valleys, etc. So if you're not properly identifying a threat for your flight, we need to be thinking about it. Maintenance, that's another big one, right? Nobody in here likes looking at the bill at the end of the big maintenance, visit. However, it's got to be done, especially if we're talking about airworthiness items related to our aircraft. So we can most definitely identify that as a threat. Or maybe you're ferrying your airplane to go get maintenance done, and maybe we need to choose a little bit different of a route because we might have a leak of some sort. So that's definitely a threat when it comes to things that we're thinking about when it comes to planning our flights. High traffic environments, right? We've noticed in our area, just as CJ was talking about not too long ago, a lot of air traffic is increasing in this area. Phelpsfield, we got Spokane International, Coeur d'Alene Airport. So we got a culmination of towered and non-towered airports in the area. Spokane obviously being a Class Charlie. That can also be a major threat. If you're not used to normally training or flying in an area that's more congested and requires you to be on the radios more constantly, that might be a consideration when it comes to, hey, am I going to fly to this area? If you don't have a lot of recent experience flying into a Class Bravo airspace, taking the weekend cross country over the Cascades to go fly into Bowen Field or, Everett, might not be the brightest idea. So, or, maybe it just involves more planning. Maybe it involves bringing someone along who's more experienced. And we'll be talking about that here in just a minute. So that's next to the next bullet point, plan accordingly. So how do we plan? So when we identify these threats, these aren't necessarily no-go decisions. What we're doing is we're simply creating a risk analysis and creating a plan that allows us to mitigate these threats. So that's the whole point of identifying and laying out these threats. So leave earlier in the day. So this is kind of relating to our first bullet point there of weather. So how could we deal or approach with a certain threat related to weather? Maybe it means leaving earlier in the day or later in the day. Taking a good look at that TAF and realizing, okay, I'm gonna have to adjust my plans. And that's kind of how we deal with some of these threats. Looking at our next point here, choose a different route. So terrain, if terrain becomes a factor, we can't make it over the Cascade Mountains today because the temperatures are too hot or the airplane's too heavy, then we're going to have to reroute and have a plan B. So that's part of, again, planning according to the threats that we have already identified. Know the limitations of your aircraft. That's a pretty big one too. And I know I've been kind of linking these in sequential order to the first bullet points up there, but it doesn't necessarily relate to maintenance. It can relate to a maintenance issue later on if you're not aware of the limitations of your aircraft, but know the limitations. So if we're talking weight and balance, or we're talking service altitudes, landing altitudes, or not landing altitudes, but landing distances at various airports. All of these things are important when it comes to choosing a specific airport that you might fly to, or whether or not you're going to fly that day. We all know that the day of the week you choose can have a huge impact on your aircraft's performance sometimes, especially in the summer months when it comes to temperatures and density altitudes. And then we have making proper radio calls. I mentioned that just again, kind of talking to our high traffic environments, but we're going into non-towered airports especially. We all know, at least I know personally, how important it is for a radio call to happen, right? Because we're all relying on each other to communicate where we're at, what our intentions are, and honestly, just update each other. There's been numerous times where, maybe someone's having an emergency out there and we can update the other guy that, hey, there's a yellow cub in the left downwind out there, just providing advisories to each other. So again, making proper radio calls is another way that we can, again, mitigate these risks. And that's the goal. So the goal isn't to completely eliminate the risks. Now, obviously, if we can do that, great, but then we wouldn't be flying. Now, the goal, again, is to mitigate these risks. So identify the threats, mitigate them. And that is a huge aspect of airline flying. That's actually what we use horizon air we use in order to, determine whether or not that we can go fly that day, or whether this specific leg is going to be appropriate or safe for us. It's all about identifying threats and planning to mitigate them accordingly. So this is what we use in the real world, as this is kind of how we mitigate these threats. So it can definitely be utilized through all aspects of our life. So this here is just an easy to read little flow diagram here on risk management process. So again, just kind of highlighting the things we talked about of identifying hazards, assessing that risk, and moving forward. So what do we do with that information? Once we've identified the threats and kind of come up with a plan, we want to assess whether or not it's going to be safe for us to move forward. So start every flight planning phase with an assessment on the risks and threats associated with the activity. What does that look like? Well, that's going to depend on what you're doing and who you are as a person. There's no FAA, rule or law out there that you have to have a certain piece of paper to write these things down on. This could be just, hey, I'm driving out to the airport today, and there's some nasty looking clouds out there. Or, wow, the wind is really kind of blowing my car going down I-90 today. I haven't done crosswind landings in a while. Is today maybe the best day for me to be go out, taking off? Or it could be like, hey, I just did 3 lessons of the CFI last week, and I feel extremely comfortable doing crosswind landings today. I think this will be a good opportunity to go do this. So it can go both ways. The point is, you're thinking about it, you're assessing whether your ability to handle the various situation, weather, etc., again, the threats, is going to be adequate enough for you to make a safe flight that day. So start every flight planning process thinking about that. So your plan, again, should seek to mitigate or address the threats. This is often a process that will need to be continued as the flight progresses. So I don't want you to think about this as just being something you do during the flight planning phase. This is something we're doing constantly, even as the flight progresses. So things change, right? We all know that weather is extremely dynamic. We know that maintenance issues pop up in the middle of flights. There's various different things that happen in the airline realm. This could be passenger medical emergencies. So a lot of different things are going to happen or could happen on your flight that you have to be able to handle as a pilot. And you have to be thinking about those things. So this risk management and threat identifying and mitigation aspect isn't something that just happens once during the pre-flight planning phase. It's a thing, again, you want to be continuously thinking about through your flight. And having a plan B, if I'm over terrain and I'm having an engine failure, what am I doing? So if you're not thinking about those kind of things while you're flying, then I would encourage you to start thinking about those things. Think about what you would do during each phase of flight and how you would mitigate the threat and come about hopefully safely. This next picture here is just kind of a very generic, classic risk severity diagram. I'm not going to dive too deep into this, but there's a lot of resources out there if you're a visual person. And I know some of the flight schools that I went to, we were required to fill out kind of a risk assessment before we went flying. And you just kind of identified like, hey, I got good sleep last night, or I didn't get good sleep last night. I got some personal issues going on. Maybe I shouldn't be flying. How's the weather? Are they within my personal limitations today? Kind of things like that. So risk assessment diagrams can be a great tool to utilizing and seeing in real life or real time, whether or not you should be flying today or not. So don't be afraid to use a resource that's tangible to help you determine whether or not flying that day might be a good idea. So choosing your route, that's kind of one of the first steps in cross-country planning, right? So how do we do that? This diagram is not too important, more just a placeholder up here. The first step, though, is what's the point of our trip? That should be kind of the first step in choosing your route, right? There's really kind of 2 options. We got business, or we have sightseeing, which I would call pleasure flying. And that's going to kind of determine where you're going to go, right? Like obviously a sightseeing trip's going to be more, relaxed. Like, okay, we're just going to kind of go fly around. So there's not really any specific points necessarily that I want to hit it, or there might be. Whereas business, obviously you're looking for the most efficient route. Let's get from point A to point B, maybe a few different pressures kind of involved there. But after that, first step is usually getting a rough course, right? So how do we get a rough course? Technology has made this extremely easy, right? In today's day and age, planning across country, in my opinion, is rather simple, and there's nothing wrong with that. A lot of people out there use ForeFly, Garmin Pilot, SkyVector, We've got flight plan, go. And then there's also paper VFR sectionals out there that people still use. So lots of different resources. And tonight's presentation isn't going to dive too deeply. In fact, it's not going to dive deeply at all into any of those subjects as far as ForeFlight, SkyVector, Garmin Pilot, or any of those things go. They're fairly self-intuitive, but they are resources that we have readily available to us. And I would highly recommend using them because they're a great tool that highlights a lot of the different flight planning purposes for you. It'll have a lot of flight plan routes saved in there from other pilots, so you can see what other people out there are doing. But anyway, that's one of the ways that you can get a rough course. So I like to use SkyVector a lot. It's just on the computer, easy to use, get lots of resources for weather and things like that. But whenever I'm cross-country planning, that's where I start. I start with just give me a rough course from point A to point B so I can see kind of what my options are when it comes to flying. Obviously, I mentioned paper VFR sectional down there, and the other reason I mentioned that is because I encourage all students to still be aware of traditional flight training methods. It is a good way to start. I know I started flight training in the age of technology, but I think we still have flight instructors that utilize the VFR sectional, and I still learn the traditional method. Why do I say that's important? One, I feel like it gives you a respect of kind of where aviation has come from and where it's going. And secondly, it's a good backup. I know people always talk about technology failing, and it is honestly pretty rare. So I'm not necessarily going to harness on the aspect of, you might be in the middle of nowhere and only have VFR sectional, in which case I do hope you know how to use it. But just mainly for the, the history and the learning aspect of being able to fly, knowing how to utilize a VFR sectional is a pretty cool tool to use. But otherwise, technology is kind of the way the industry is moving, and use it. But we'll talk more about more of the risks involved with that and how to mitigate them. So again, moving on with choosing our route here. Let's go back to talking about aeronautical decision-making and our risk analysis mindset. What are some threats when it comes to choosing our route and how we're going to mitigate those? So we've kind of mentioned some of these earlier. We got terrain, fuel efficiency, diversion airports, nav aids, airspace. So now we plan a route with these things in mind, and we realize that flying directly from point A to point B isn't always possible. So again, that's when we come back to our risk analysis sheet that we started out with. We've identified threats, and we kind of have a plan to mitigate those. So when we've drawn out our rough course on SkyVector, ForeFlight, VFR sectional, we want to pay close attention to terrain, fuel efficiency, diversion airports, nav aids, airspace. Where are we going to go when things don't start going well? And how is our plan going to continue to allow us to mitigate those risks along the way? So that's the mindset we want to take here. So I've kind of blown up that diagram from the last photo, and I just plotted a very rough course on here from Phelps Field down to the Pullman Moscow Regional Airport. And, at first glance, just really not a lot of threats. And for anyone that's flown that lake, I think we probably agree there's not a lot of terrain on there, but, it can be a factor. But if you're flying from point A to point B, let's say in the middle of August or in the heat of fire season, and you've only got 3 miles of visibility due to smoke, et cetera, pretty easy to lose your way when every farm out there looks exactly the same and you can only see it from, a couple miles of visibility. Is it legal to be flying in that? Yeah, absolutely. You're kind of pushing the envelope there as far as, VFR and IFR, but there's nothing wrong with it. And that could be a great learning opportunity and experience in flight planning, holding a heading, holding a course, and making sure that you're hitting your VFR checkpoints. So if we wanted to do something like that, we've got a lot of different resources just looking at a VFR section that we can use. We've got the Rosalia Airport there that we were already talking about earlier, and those make for great checkpoints when you're on a VFR flight plan, is knowing where you're going and what to expect next. We got multiple highways that you can follow down. The other nice thing about using airports as checkpoints is that's also a diversion airport. If you've got an issue, you kind of have a little stop along the way, a little rest stop, food stop, etc. So these are all things that you should be thinking about. Nav aids, Pullman Airport, we got the Pullman VOR just to the west of the airport there. We got Lewiston just beyond that. So these are all things that you want to be thinking about ahead of time. These are things to be considering ahead of time so that if an issue arises or your plan changes en route, you have options to consider at your fingertips. You're not scrambling at the last second, as your propeller's, spooling off because you lost your prop governor. These are things that you've already considered. You already have contingency plans. So that's why the pre-flight planning phase is rather important, if not the most important aspect in cross-country planning, because this is where you're developing contingency plans and continuing to mitigate those risks before they even happen. So that's why I bring this up. is just so that you're thinking about these threats and how to mitigate them along the way. Weather briefings, those are important, right? How does the app on your phone using Apple Weather, Google Weather, any of that, does that count as a weather briefing? No. Great tool though to get a big picture kind of idea of what's going to go on that way. I don't want to discourage you from looking at a weather app on your phone, but it's unfortunately not a legal form of getting a weather briefing prior to go flying, and neither is it going to give you a very in-depth analysis of what's going on that day. But weather briefings are important because, as we talked about earlier, weather is a big threat when we go flying. So obtaining a weather briefing is, again, one of the most important steps of pre-flight. Why is that? So we can avoid flying into something like that. That could be rather healthy. So storms, winds aloft, icing conditions, etc. There's lots of different things that could be gained from a weather briefing. Today's seminar, I'm not going to go super in depth again on how to gain a weather briefing, but rather what our mindset should be when approaching a weather briefing. Again, we're thinking about threats and how are we going to mitigate them. So just because there might be a thunderstorm at some point along the route doesn't mean we're not going to fly that day. It just means, again, we might be choosing a different route. So how do we take the information that we're going to glean from our research and from our pre-flight planning and make an educated decision on where we're going to go or how, again, we're going to mitigate that risk? So what are considered some FAA-approved weather sources? Well, we got NOAA, AWC, WSI. Again, those are acronyms for various websites and apps that are out there by authorized weather sources. A lot of your apps that we mentioned earlier, FortFly, Garmin, Pilot, a lot of those sources provide weather briefings built into it. So if you're doing your flight planning on one of those apps, you're kind of getting the whole real deal package right there when it comes to pre-flight planning, NOTAMs, weather, etc. But weather's a big thing, and we know that it changes a lot, especially in the fall and spring seasons. That's where the inconsistency lies. So the reason why I'm kind of harping on this a lot lately, or at least right now, is things change and things change fast, especially with icing. I'll fully admit that I've been in training situations before where I felt uncomfortable in a weather situation, whether that be thunderstorm, icing conditions, etc. And it's like, wow, I wish I would have taken a deeper look at this, and not necessarily a deeper look, but having respect for the weather out there and that it can change, and that if you're not looking at your Proc Charts, you're not looking at TAPs, you're not looking at PIREPs, or even giving PIREPs, you can find yourself in a very uncomfortable situation very fast. So again, this takes us back to our previous point, pre-flight planning. What are you going to do when the weather doesn't work out, or the weather doesn't plan, or weather doesn't live up to the forecast? How many times have we gone flying the TAF was not even close to what it was forecasted to be multiple times? So what are you going to do when that situation arises? What's going to be your plan B? So again, we come back to those mitigating threats. Hey, we had a diversion airport. Rosalia was on the way to Poland. We're going to take a quick stop in there and check out the new airport. So these are different tools that you can utilize and kind of keep in your toolbox, mental toolbox, when it comes to flying. So just got a little Proc chart up there. I actually took this snapshot just after that bomb cyclone that we had a couple of weeks ago. It was pretty crazy. That was some of the most interesting weather that I've ever seen in the Pacific Northwest. I was flying in and out of the Seattle area, actually at the height of that bomb cyclone, and saw the altimeter pressure get down to 2901, which was like the lowest recorded pressure, I guess, ever in the Seattle area. So it was pretty wild, and it made for some very interesting weather coming through the area, lots of icing, winds. And again, that's some threatening weather. But if you're able to come up with a plan to mitigate the threats, you can still navigate some of these different things. But again, it just comes with adequate pre-flight planning and having contingency plans and things. Proc charts, those are your friends. So when do we start looking at the weather? Because that could be kind of a key aspect when it comes to mitigating threats and have to plan on cross-country planning. I start looking at the weather typically a few days in advance, and I'm not even just talking about airline flying. This is just talking about like local stuff out of the Portland airport. But I do look at the weather typically a couple of days in advance, usually for airline flying too, because it's good to have a nice idea of what to anticipate. One of my biggest catchphrases in life is big picture, and I apply that to many different things, but it works very great in aviation. Is how do we have a big picture? Another term for that the FAA has defined would be situational awareness. So situational awareness starts with all aspects of pre-flight planning and especially weather. So how do we exercise good situational awareness? Well, familiarizing ourselves with all available resources and information. So one of the ways we do that with weather briefings is, I start looking in advance. What are the trends? Are things trending in a positive direction or a negative direction? Because then that's going to give you more perspective on whether that flight, should maybe happen that day, or maybe we should delay it. Look at NETAR history trends. That can give you a lot of information as well. So it's recommended to start looking at the weather a few days in advance, get to know the weather patterns. Where are the cold fronts moving? Did this cold front just turn into a stationary front? How are things moving? Or is the stationary front now turning into a cold front and moving out of the area? Because maybe that might mean that we're going to move into some better weather, and taking a flight that day might not be such a bad idea. What are some threats regarding weather in our neck of the woods? Well, we've already kind of talked about that a lot. Icing and snow. So again, that might be a threat if you're going to go fly the Piper Cub in the traffic pattern that day, or you're going to go fly the Piper Cub down to Pullman, but maybe you're taking a PC-12 down to Pullman that day. Might not be that much of an issue. You got the ice boots, your IFR equipped, so might not be a problem. But again, if we can think about ahead of time what some of the threats are going to be, we might be able to mitigate or change our plan on that. So smoke, we talked about that already. July through September, very heavy when it comes to smoke. So maybe that means we're not going to go on across country this day, or we're going to wait for the winds to shift, or we're going to wait for that cold front to blow through and clear out some of that smoke. High winds, we just experienced that over the last couple of days, right? I know I saw the Spokane airport was reporting up to 54 knots of wind on one of their hourly updates. Fort Lane got up to like 49 knots. I mean, that is some significant winds, and that's just around the airports. I'm sure winds aloft were just as feisty. So things to be considering and thinking about if you're not planning ahead and looking at the weather patterns, or the weather that's to come, and then you might be caught off guard or caught by surprise. So again, the goal is to not be caught off guard. Low ceilings, I think we're all very familiar with that happening this time of year as well. So that's what we talk about, having a contingency plan. Maybe you're on your way from Phelpsfield down to Pullman, and some freezing fog rolled into the Pullman Valley there, and you need a backup plan. Continuing to push forward and giving into the peer pressures is not how we want to deal with that. So oftentimes turning around. And that's why we talked about fuel efficiency as well being another consideration. And we'll talk about that some more too, but having those plan Bs needs to be in mind. So again, how do we respond to these threats? Have personal limitations. That's a big one that I like to talk about when it comes to weather, is have a personal limitation on, hey, this is going to be the minimum, ceiling that I'm going to go do a VFR cross country in. It might be, those ceilings might be, those limitations might be more limiting for cross country, right? Because you're traveling over terrain, you're traveling over ground. So you might have, limitations that are less restrictive if you're only doing traffic pattern work or something like that. But having personal limitations is big, and knowing what they are ahead of time. Don't just come up with it when you're in the air. Have something down on a piece of paper ahead of time that you can look at and be like, hey, this is going to be my no-go point right here. If the winds are above 35 knots gusting, then we're not going to do it. It's not worth it. And this isn't something that you just do in the GA world. I started out with personal limitations in the G world, and I've established new limitations with each new aircraft that I fly, whether that be a little tail aircraft or a Q400 out of the Spokane airport. I have personal limitations of like, hey, I'm not going to go beyond this, whether the manual personally allows it, or the airline personally allows it or not. Like, hey, I don't feel comfortable, and I don't feel like this is safe. And don't make it a pride issue either, because everyone out there has different abilities, different experiences, and different skill levels. So Jim Bob over here might have different limitations than what Bob Jones over here has. So just know that, hey, these are my personal limitations, and you can expand on those limitations, with a certified flight instructor or somebody else who has adequate experience and wants to kind of train you along the way. So just keep that in mind, and those are ways that you can, identify a threat and hopefully mitigate it rather easily. Have a plan B if you're already en route. We talked about that a little bit already. And then don't give into the pressure for, get there-itis and other common hazards, right? It's like, oh, I'm almost there. Oh, I could see the approach lights coming in. I know I'm not IFR rated, but, we can get there. We can do it. Like, no, scud running is not the way to go. It's always better to live another day, fly the airplane another day, take a second chance, think about it, deep breather. You will be very happy once you're on the ground. That's the famous quote. It's better to be on the ground wishing you were in the sky than in the sky wishing you were on the ground. So Think about it and apply it. All right, I think we beat weather to death here. Performance. So this is an interesting topic. How often are you honestly calculating your wing balance, takeoff and landing distance, and your performance numbers before you go fly? I mean, not super often, right? You know, I'll admit, there's been times where you're flying a small airplane and you're like, oh, I know this airplane. Oh, I've flown this airplane. I've got hundreds of hours in this airplane. I've got the takeoff performance, memorized. And sure, do what you got to do, but calculating performance is technically a required element of pre-flight planning, and it's in the FARs. And I'm not just saying that to be the FAR police here, but I'm saying it because it matters. We talk about identifying threats and mitigating risks. Well, this can be a huge aspect of this, especially when we're flying in summer months like July, when we get those rare weeks where they don't seem so rare anymore, where they're 105 degrees outside. And you're like, well, I did it in the Cherokee before, should be able to do it in the Cherokee now. Doesn't always work out that way. And that's where we need to take some extra time to, make sure that our aircraft is equipped and that the weather is going to be cooperating. And again, this goes back to our pre-flight planning of using technology for flight, Garmin Pilot, SkyVector, Flight Plan Go. All of these apps and websites make it extremely easy to calculate your performance. I mean, you're talking a couple clicks of buttons here, and you're like, "Oh, I got the green light. We're good to go." So take your time, do some pre-flight planning. But I'm not just talking about the takeoff numbers and landing distances. We're also talking about fuel planning. And the reason why I mention this is complacency. So complacency is an easy trap to fall into when you become comfortable with your airplane in the environment you're flying in, right? You got that airplane, that airplane inside and out, all the airspeeds you land at, et cetera. But again, complacency is the easy trap in here. That's the threat. That's the threat that we're identifying is complacency. One of the leading causes of aircraft accidents and crashes is pilots running out of fuel. This is often the result of, go figure, poor pre-flight planning. So how do we mitigate this risk? We do pre-flight planning. So what does that look like for fuel planning? Proper fuel management is essential for cross-country flights. So again, we talked about how can we accomplish this? Calculate it. So take that time, come up with a plan B, know that, hey, I might not make it into Pullman today. Do I have enough fuel to turn around and make it into Rosalia? So these are all things to be thinking about when you're flying an airplane. And that occurs at all levels of flying. It occurs whether you're in a GA airplane and you're in a mediocre airplane, whether you're in a Q400 or you're in an A380 flying across the world. Fuel planning is necessary and it happens all the time. And you, as the pilot, are the one that's ultimately responsible for making that decision. It's not your passenger. It's not your flight instructor. It's not your flight dispatcher. You're at an airline. It's not the fuel guy who might be fueling up your airplane. It's none of their responsibility. It's your responsibility as the pilot in command. So make sure that you are doing the proper calculations as necessary to ensure that you are operating your airplane in a safe and orderly manner. So when it comes to fuel, make sure we're doing the fuel planning or crunching the numbers for that accurately. Here's a little snippet from an article I'll read for you. It was really interesting. This is just highlighting the statistic on fuel-related accidents in general aviation. It says fuel management is a persistent problem for general aviation pilots. It checks in at a number of 4 on a list of pilot-related accident causes. This trend has been improving in recent years, so that's good. And 2018 had the second fewest fuel management accidents in the last 10 years. So perhaps newer technology like fuel totalizers, iPad planning apps, and glass cockpits with range rings are helping pilots make better decisions. However, over 50 pilots bent airplanes and around half a dozen are killed every year due to this. I'm not even going to try to say that word right now. Thank you. Preventable problem. Fuel contamination is exceedingly rare, so I know some people like to point that out, but they're highlighting that for us in the article. And then in roughly 60% of cases, the pilot simply ran out of fuel due to poor planning or inadequate in-flight decision-making. Roughly 40% of the accidents were caused by fuel starvation, where the airplane had usable fuel, but the pilot did not get it to the engine. So somebody obviously wasn't clicking over the selector tanks. So I know, kind of a long-winded little article there, but to kind of rehash or kind of recapture the highlights in here, it's talking about pilot error. Pilot error was to blame for these aircraft running out of fuel, these accidents that took place. And I got linked back to poor pre-flight planning, or failing to manage the tanks in flight, switching from the left tank to the right tank, etc. So again, I'm bringing this up to highlight a threat, and the mitigation, the plan to mitigate this is planning ahead. Hey, do we have enough fuel to make it from point A to point B? And this could be then linked back to the PowerPoint of weather. What are my winds aloft today? How many times are you checking winds aloft going from point A to point B? You're like, oh, I've done the Phelps to Pullman run many times. It's 52 miles, barely across country. Yeah, but you don't know what the winds aloft are going to be that day. Maybe you got a 100-knot headwind. You're like, oh, wow, I should have looked at that before I left. Now I have a little bit of get-there-itis because I'm halfway there. What do? Do I turn around and go back to Phelps and miss the business meeting I had in Pullman? So these are things you want to be thinking about. And maybe while you're thinking about that, you got distracted halfway in cruise and you forgot to switch your fuel tank over. So again, this is why we plan these things ahead of time, so you don't have to be distracted about thinking about your plan B, so you can focus on flying the airplane. So we can see how all of these things are intertwined, and they can prevent us from moving forward. So again, how can we eliminate threats associated with aircraft performance? Calculate it. What are some of the tools for doing that? The AFM, POH, so that's kind of where you start. ForeFlight, we've talked about that. There's a lot of different profiles that are already built into ForeFlight, probably for your aircraft. So if you're new to flying, check it out. It's not as hard or as difficult as you think it is. Here's a funny little meme that I created for aircraft performance. I'll read it out loud for you. So we got Spock over there. It says, what my friends think I do, and it shows him holding an E6B. And then we got, it looks like a mathematician in the middle, says what my mom thinks I do. And then we got a little kid with an abacus on the right, says what my CFI thinks I do. And then we got like some Piper charts there on the bottom, what the FAA thinks I do. And then in the middle, another mathematician of what I think I do. And then finally, we got what I actually do. It shows a dude sitting in a recliner with an iPad. So it's not that hard. We can do the performance. All right, just a few more touches on performance here. Flying proper VFR altitudes. I bring that up because that's a huge aspect in cross-country flight planning, right? And sightseeing can be tempting to deviate from some of those VFR altitudes. You can, right? There's certain altitudes, there's parameters. The federal aviation regulations are very specific on how VFR altitudes work. So we're just going to kind of run into that. So what are they? Above 3,000 feet AGL, and that's kind of what I was talking about. Below 3,000 feet AGL, it's kind of no man's land. You kind of do whatever you want, but that's where we talk about making appropriate radio calls and kind of trying to plan ahead of what people are doing. Otherwise, we end up in potentially fatal accidents, as a lot of you are probably aware, happened over the Port Lake just over the last year and a half. So we want to be thinking ahead and planning ahead on these things, and knowing where there's high environments of traffic, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be the Class Bravo in Seattle. Very well could be, Lake Port Orleans, Airport. It could be downtown Spokane, during Christmas time. So we want to look at the Christmas lights. So again, we want to be thinking about these things and putting it at the forefront of our head. So again, VFR flying altitudes, a magnetic course of 0 degrees through 179. We want to be flying any 1,000 foot NSL altitude plus 500 feet. And the reason why that's important is you're getting intermixed with IFR traffic. And, you're not required to be on flight following on across country, but, the IFR guys are, because they have to be talking to tower. So again, same thing goes too for IFR. This isn't necessarily just a VFR discussion today. It primarily is aimed at VFR. The same thing for IFR, make sure you're filing at correct altitude. And obviously ATC is going to sort that out for you when you get your clearance or whether you're in the air. But again, this goes into the proper pre-flight plan. How can we be proficient in that? So again, this talks about the opposite of flying at even altitude to plus 500 feet. So again, that's between the heading of 180 and 350. Again, that's magnetic course one thing. The number one reason for aircraft accidents is mid-air collisions. I kind of alluded to this earlier, and that was my presentation about 2 years ago. So that's why I highlight this point, because a lot of that had to do with folks not making video calls or flying at the wrong VFR altitudes. Now, obviously, there's a transition period when you're descending or ascending out of an airport. But again, this is talking about kind of the middle of the flight. When we talked about the third pillar on that risk analysis diagram that we were looking at earlier was in cruise. So how are these things happening? Mid-air collisions. So that's why it's important to know the altitudes you're flying at, and you're doing so safely. So again, this talks about most mid-airs typically happen within 5 nautical miles of the airport. But again, we want to talk about flying the proper traffic pattern altitudes, so that's a huge role, and traffic pattern directions are very important. We're gonna talk about that more on the next slide here. Airport familiarization. This is a huge aspect of pre-flight planning, in my opinion, is knowing where you're going and what you're going to do when you arrive, either at the traffic pattern or on the ground. Now, obviously, if you're flying in the local area from, you may have been to Pullman a handful of times, that's not a very difficult airport to navigate. But maybe you're going to be going to Spokane International for the first time, or you're going to be going into Boeing Field, and you're going to be busy talking on the radios the entire time, and you don't really have time to figure out where you're going to go when you land on the ground. The tower's yelling at you. They're like, keep the speed up. You got a Learjet on a 2-mile final. You're getting eaten up in your Piper Cub, and you're like, make a left at Bravo, right turn Bravo 4. They're just shouting off all these different taxi instructions to you, and you're like, I haven't even gotten the flaps up yet. My airplane doesn't even have flaps. So, you're freaking out because you're behind the airplane. So how do we stay ahead of the airplane? Again, pre-flight planning. And a big aspect of that is airport familiarization. This is something I used to stress to my flight students all the time when I was actively flight instructing. I was like, hey, when you're doing the cross-country planning, what are you doing to familiarize your airplane? So we've got a question about it.
What do you say, unable?
Yeah, there you go. Exactly. And that's actually a good point. Don't let air traffic control pressure you either. If you didn't plan accordingly, that doesn't mean you continue to make poor decisions. It means you take a break, take a deep breath, stop in the taxiway if you need to, and be like, hey, I need some progressive taxi here, or I need a minute, because that's ultimately important, right? Is flying the airplane first. Let's talk about aviate, navigate, and communicate. So that doesn't dissipate or disappear just because you put yourself necessarily in a poor situation. Don't make that situation poor. So continue to make wise decisions. Continue with airport familiarization here. So what do you do to familiarize yourself with an airport you've never been to before? Right? There's lots of different tools out there and lots of different resources. These are some of the ones that I use. Is obviously the airport diagram. That's kind of the first place you start. And what I like to do when I'm going into an airport that I haven't been to before is I like to kind of plan what I'm going to do. So usually that's like, okay, an FBO, right? That's kind of the first place we're going. In the airline realm, obviously I'm going to be going to the terminal gates, but I do the same thing in the airline realm. If I'm going to an airport that I haven't been to, I actually look at it usually a couple days in advance because I want to know where I'm going to go. Most embarrassing thing is going to be stopping on the taxiway. I'm like, I don't know where I'm going. Well, you should have thought about that beforehand. So I usually start with the airport diagram. What can I expect? Where am I going to go? What taxiways, am I either A, going to be restricted to or not restricted to? What are the NOTAMs showing? Take a look at the NOTAMs, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more as well. But feel free to mark up your airport diagram too. A lot of the apps that we use, like ForeFlight, Garmin Pilot, JetApp, a lot of these different things allow you to use a little cursor with your finger on there, and you can kind of mark different things up on the airport. So what I like to do is I like to mark up my anticipated taxi route. Like, hey, this is what I'm planning on doing. Obviously, the plan can change, so be flexible, but have an idea where you're going to go. So if you're going to a busy airport, be like, look, this is where I expect to be taxiing. And then mark other things like, hey, taxiway Delta over here is closed. I'm going to put some big red X's on there so I don't accidentally have, a runway or a taxiway incursion. So these are things that you could do hours, days in advance that help you plan and think in the minute. So you're not having to scramble at the last second to figure out like, hey, what do I need to do while air traffic control's yelling at me? So just be thinking, okay, this is what I'm going to do. This is my plan, and be ready to adapt to that plan if it's necessary. So airport diagram, chart supplement, great things to look at. Anticipated taxi route, traffic pattern, altitude, and direction. That's important, right? So obviously, if you're flying in airports you're very familiar with, it might not be as important because you already know the area. But if you're going to Pullman for the first time, what altitude am I supposed to be flying at for my traffic pattern? What direction am I going to be going to? Because again, if we don't look at these things, we're going to end up as another statistic on a mid-air collision within 5 nautical miles of an airport. So again, we're identifying threats and we're mitigating them by planning ahead. So, and having these things written down on a sticky note or something while you're going flying is an awesome idea. I used to do that all the time as a flight student. And then especially as a flight instructor, I would try to train the same thing for my students. Is if I was going for 3 different airports on a cross country that day, what I would do is I would take a little notepad and I would write down where I was going. I'd write down the CTAF frequency, the ADIS frequency, the traffic pattern altitude, what direction I was going to. Is that what you kind of have like a little cheat sheet right there as you're getting to know. And obviously the more experience you gain, And the more knowledge you have of the aviation industry and these various things, some of that stuff is going to be a lot easier for you to find, and you might not necessarily have to write it down. But things change, and it all depends on what the situation dictates and where you're going to be, going, what your mission is. So frequencies, FBO location, right? Obviously, if it's not a planned stop, these things are going to be different. You're going to have to figure out some of these things more on the fly. But if it is a planned stop, you have no excuse to do some research into where you're going, right? Don't be that guy that lands and town asks where you're going, and you're like, I don't know, whatever FBO's out here. Like, I mean, obviously you can do that, but the goal of being a pilot, right, is to be professional, proficient. So how do we emulate that image while we're out there flying? How do we make the radio more efficient for other people? So have a game plan. Obviously, like I said, there's exceptions to that rule. So I'm not out here to judge everyone who's making a radio call and doesn't know where they're going on the ground, because we've all been there, have been there. But try to have a game plan. Try to know ahead, and technology makes that easy. NOTAMs, that's a huge one, right? So we definitely want to be checking NOTAMs. We'll talk about Google Maps and Earth here in a second, but just a quick highlight on NOTAMs. Definitely be checking your NOTAMs. Lots of resources to do that now. It's going to sound like a gang bell here. ForeFlight, Garmin Pilot, all of those apps make it extremely easy for you to go and check your NOTAMs. And check them often. Just because you checked them 2 days ago doesn't mean there was no changes. In fact, NOTAMs change constantly, and they'll change. They'll update multiple times in a day. The ASOS just went down, or AOS, whatever, just went down in Coeur d'Alene the other day after that windstorm, and then it was up again the next morning. So make sure you're checking those things, because things happen fast. Runway closures happen. If an aircraft breaks down on a runway, oftentimes they get a NOTAM put up there pretty fast. So just be aware. Google Maps and Earth. The reason I bring that up is that's been a huge tool for me when it comes to planning on where I'm going to be going at an airport. It's awesome. I'll go into usually Google Maps, and then I'll go into like satellite view, and I'll go take a look at the airport that I'm landing at. Like, hey, what does the runway surface look like? Obviously, things get updated in that time frame, but take a look at it. Like, hey, where's the FBO? Where's the fuel farm at? It doesn't, like a self-service fuel farm doesn't always show up on the chart supplement or the airport diagram. So I'll go to Google Earth or Google Maps, and I'll go, tootle around and be like, oh, here it is on the ramp. That way, it kind of gives you a better idea of where you're going and what you can see around there. It's a nice idea for looking at terrain and other stuff like that. So I would highly recommend making use of some of these other resources like that. FBO research, that's pretty self-explanatory. So just make sure where you're going is going to have the services needed. And actually, just to kind of expand on that, I think we've all kind of witnessed or seen some of the impacts of that over just this last summer with the lack of fuel getting up to some of these airports. So that's why I specifically mentioned FBO research in light of recent events. Is call them, make sure they have gas available, whether it be at their self-service farm or at their fuel truck. Because I've heard at least 3 stories this last summer of various pilots landing at airports around here in the Northwest being stranded because they couldn't get fuel. And that's because they either there wasn't a NOTAM put out about it, so they weren't aware, or B, they weren't aware of the area or the FBO, and they had no way of getting a means out there was no fuel available. So do your research. If you're going somewhere that you're not familiar with or even are familiar with, make sure that there's services available for your needs, because you don't want to be stuck there. So tie downs, I just do that in there. I know it's not a requirement, but nobody wants to come out a couple hours later after a windstorm and find their airplane upside down. So just things to be thinking about when it comes to airport organization. We're almost done here. Equipment. So that's another aspect of cross-country planning. So depending on the aircraft you're flying, this can vary, but GPS database is up to date. That could be a big threat that we can mitigate there. So GPS updates come out every 28 days. So this is a good way to stay ahead of the bell curve on that. Make sure you've got your databases updated. You can get those. I guess what I'm trying to say is your various charts rely on those updates. So if you want to be flying with the most accurate charts, if you're using what's built into your aircraft, make sure it's up to date. Otherwise, have the backup. It's another thing to be flying with. ADS-B transponder, depending on the airspace you will be traversing. I know that it's become fairly popular now, just because of the various airspace requirements that are out there that require ADS-B. But if you don't have it yet, great tool to utilize, especially if you're looking for ADS-B in. They give you a lot of traffic updates. Survival kit. This I specifically mentioned for cross-country flying, because how many times are you going to be prepared for when that engine does quit? You're out in the middle of nowhere. You're going to have to put it down on on a farm and the farmhouse is 3 miles away and it might be snowing or, blister or not. Have a survival kit with you when you're on a cross country. Whether, kind of got a little picture of it down there, but that can hold anything in it from, like a survival blanket to some snacks and food. Have some options and resources that will tie you over until you're able to get help. iPad and charger, maybe a backup battery. So we were talking about technology earlier, and this is kind of where I was coming back to a thread on this. If you're going to be relying on an iPad and all that stuff, which is excellent, there's nothing against using an iPad in the flight deck. Have some backups, whether it be a backup battery or a charger or a way to keep your iPad charged. Nobody wants to be on a cross-country trip without any sort of backup, and then be kind of hosed. If you're leaving the area again, flying through 3 miles of smoke, kind of pulling in the middle of July, and your iPad quits on you, and Highway 95 and one of the other highways over here is looking very similar. You don't want to end up in no man's land and forget to switch your fuel tank at the same time. Hydration, food, so kind of just normal human needs there. And then lastly, we're kind of wrapping up with filing a flight plan. So who all files a flight plan when they fly VFR cross country? Does anybody here file plans? Yeah, I've seen a few things. Yeah, I heard you say it should be everybody. And I agree. Yeah, it's very easy to file a flight plan when you're going to be flying across country, and there's a lot of benefits to it. Specifically, you have somebody tracking you. So if you go down or you have some sort of emergency and you're out stranded halfway between here and Pullman, which definitely could be worse places to be stranded, you have somebody that's going to be checking in on you. When I say somebody, we're specifically talking about the flight service station and then eventually search and rescue. You haven't made it to your destination by the time that you put in your flight plan, which again goes all the way back to flight plan. If you're going to file a flight plan, make sure you're putting in accurate numbers as far as your en route time and where you're going to be going. Because if you don't, they're going to have a hard time tracking you down when you don't make it to your destination. Another benefit to filing a flight plan is getting to talk with flight service, which isn't always a benefit, but if you know what I mean, you're going to get every airman and pirate within a 150-mile radius. But you can easily obtain weather updates through flight service along the route. So utilize it. It's another resource. So maybe things are changing. They can give you, again, that big picture. They can help aid your situational awareness when it comes to looking at the weather and looking at where you're going to be going. So how do we file a flight plan? You can go the old fast route and call flight service at 1-800-WX-BRIEF, or they got the website, or we can use ForeFlight, Private Pilot, Flight Plan Go, what other people are using. So again, I'm only bringing that up to stress the importance of using our flight plan. So how do we open our flight plan? Again, you could do it via the local flight service frequency, so utilizing that in the air. What technology has allowed us to do is it's allowed us to open flight plans via text message. So as soon as you file a flight plan and it's been accepted, you get a cool little text message to your phone or to the app, and you can open and close VFR flight plans without having to talk to anybody or anything. Simply by saying like open, close, yes, no, all via your phone. So they make it extremely easy to open and close VFR flight plans now. So I would highly recommend it. A little screenshot of what the old classic flight plan forms used to look like. This here's just notating not closing our flight plan. So again, flight service frequency, we talked about technology, text, phone call, app, etc. What happens if we forget to close our flight plan? Yeah, they'll let you know. You're definitely going to get a nice little call. The caller ID is going to be like FAA or like federal government. I've gotten that phone call before. You're like, oh, crud, what did I do? You're like, whose airspace did I fly through? So you're going to get that call, and it's super easy. Just answer it and be like, I'm so sorry, I forgot to close my VFR flight plan. But that's how you know the system works right there. You know that people are watching and people legitimately care, and filing a flight plan serves a purpose. You talk about having a safety net while you're flying. That's the way you do it. So if you don't, search and rescue process will begin, and they legitimately do. They call people like almost right out of the gate to start the process. And the Civil Air Patrol will be excited because they get to go use their airplane. But everyone else is going to be a little more frustrated, and we're spending taxpayer dollars when it comes to that. And not that that's the biggest thing that I'm trying to work on here, but utilize the service. It's an excellent service. Don't let the fear of forgetting to close it negate you from wanting to use it. But it is a great tool to use. Now, post flight. So this is us wrapping up here. After a cross-country trip, it could be helpful to kind of do the following. So obviously a post-flight walk-around. How many people here do a walk-around after you're done flying? Okay, I see quite a few hands raised in here. That's excellent. And that's something I feel like is not encouraged enough in aviation. And the reason why I bring it up is it's a great way to trap any maintenance issues that might have happened on the way in, bird strikes, maybe even a big bug or something like that. And it allows you to just kind of wrap up the entire process. Like, hey, did I miss something earlier, or something happened during cruise? Because nobody wants to be, figuring that out, the next time they're going to go flying, early flight 5 in the morning, and like, oh, I missed this flight tire, or something like that. But lots of different reasons and advantages to doing a post-flight walk around. And I would encourage it. It doesn't have to be as rigorous as your pre-flight. For some people it is. It's totally up to you. No requirement on it. But even just a nice little post-flight walk around, just like, hey, the airplane's attacked, nothing missing here. Journal your experience. This one's a little bit different, but this was huge for me as a flight student. So for those of you that are newer or just starting out in the aviation realm, even some of you veterans out there in the aviation industry, journal your experience. What did you learn? What would you do differently next time? And what would you do again? And a lot of us do this naturally all the time, right? You're driving home, you're like, man, it was just kind of mad. Like I could have put in a little bit more aileron correction in, et cetera, right? So that's an excellent step in learning how to be a good pilot is self-analysis. What could I do better? And but what went well? A lot. We always harp on ourselves. I feel like that's probably just a pride thing, or part of the step of always getting better is what can I do better? But what went well? What went well on this cross-country trip? Like, wow, I really did some good pre-flight planning, and this really paid off in this regard. So think about those things. Think about the things that went well and how you could exercise those again on another flight. And then share those with other people. That's kind of my next bullet point on here is share your experience with others, right? That's how we all learn. We learn from stories. We learn from prior experiences, and we learn from people being willing to open up about, maybe the lessons they've learned, but then also the great things that have happened to them. Be like, hey, check this out, man. I was able to do this, and because I learned this, it allowed me to do this. Like, how awesome is that? Sharing each other's successes just as much as we learn from others' failures. But journaling that could be a great way to do that. I know I had a huge binder of things where I journaled after every flight of like, hey, these are some areas that I really want to work on. And the reason why I find that important is because I would look it over before every flight. Like, okay, on my last flight, I need to go work on some more right rudder on the takeoff roll. And left wing was a little bit low. How do we correct for these things? So that way you're being more purposeful with your flight training, and it doesn't even have to be flight training. It could be, again, just across country from Feltfield down to Pullman, just to go get a burger or something. What are some things that I could be working on in order to continue my proficiency and to continue improving as a pilot out there? So those are the biggest things. That's my presentation on aeronautical decision making as it relates to aviation. I appreciate you guys. Are there any questions out there? And that's kind of taken on. If not, that's totally okay too.
Well, I hear a true story. A buddy of mine was a pilot or first officer for Northwest, and he lands in Chicago here. The ground controller comes on and says, Northwest 129, take right on Bravo, left on Alpha, left on double echo, hold short of the cargo, contact ground 1216. And he says, correct, Chicago ground, Northwest 129. Do you hear how slow I talk? That's how fast I listen.
I like that. That's great. Yeah, just some closing thoughts. I just want to say thank you, in that aeronautical decision making relates to all aspects of flying here. So I hope you were able to learn something. I really move on with some things. Take it with you as you're flying.